Thank you, Ashley and Rennie. And good morning and welcome to those of you who are joining us online this morning. Sorry we weren't here last week, but it was a bit of a challenge to just get here. So it was kind of interesting, you know, down where I lived in southern Tulsa, it was very icy. I couldn't even get to my car. And some of you got to the church and said, what ice is she talking about? So, you know, microclimates are such. Well, on Wednesday, we began Ash Wednesday, this period of Lent, the 40-day time of preparing our hearts and our souls for Easter. Now, this 40-day time period, usually every year, I do some sort of Bible study. Last year, we looked at the book of Exodus, and in less than 6 weeks, we were able to get Moses to the Promised Land. We did a good job. Well, this month, we are going to look at the Gospel of Luke. So let's put a little framework on our gospel story so we can understand a little bit about them. The four Gospels that were ultimately agreed upon, remember there were many, many Gospels that were written in the late 100 to 200 time period, but the four Gospels that were accepted partly because, or in large part because, they were a narrative. Those of you who might be familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, it is simply 114 sayings. Well, quite frankly, after about the third saying, it's pretty boring. Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, for 114 sayings. And so although we can say, well, maybe there was some theological implications in the story, the reason it wasn't popular, it was boring to read. And what we have to remember is we are talking about a time and an era when people wrote things by hand. This was not where we looked on Amazon, said I want 4 copies in 4 different languages with hardcover, softcover, and the Kindle edition. It didn't happen like that. So when you got a gospel, it was a valued treasure. A valued treasure. Now remember, just to put a little historical context on it, Jesus died around the year 30 CE. We don't see anything written that we have, doesn't say it didn't, but we can kind of historically know it probably didn't happen until the letters of Paul, the first one sort of appearing around 52. Okay, so that's quite a bit of time has gone by. The first Gospels, with the Gospel of Mark, probably came on the scene around the year 70. All right, so that is 40 years after Jesus has left the earth. What I want you to understand is the Gospels are not primary witnesses to the life of Jesus. They are a compilation of stories, favorite stories. Hear that, favorite stories of the various communities. And Luke is no exception. We believe that Matthew and Luke were probably written in the mid-80s. They were probably written in either Rome or Ephesus, a much more sophisticated Gentile audience, because by now the movement that sprung up in Jesus' name had left Palestine altogether. They were not speaking Hebrew or Aramaic. They were speaking Greek. They were out in a much more cultured, cosmopolitan world. And as such, the Gospels, and we especially see this in Matthew and Luke, had to address a different kind of audience. They had to touch the hearts and lives of people differently than like the writings of Paul, although Paul too was a very cosmopolitan man. First and foremost, we know that they did have, Matthew and Luke, somewhere along the line got a hold of a Gospel of Mark, because we know historically that it's what we call the Markian spine. The Markian spine is Mark gave a chronological order to the stories of Jesus. Did they really and truly happen the way the Gospels say? We have no way of knowing. But Mark said, you know, this is just a bunch of stories. We got to put them in. You know, we got to put some sequence around them. Jesus can't be in Jerusalem, then suddenly he's on the Sea of Galilee. They're not next door to each other. So Mark created this chronology of events that both Matthew and Luke chose to use as part of the underpinning of their Gospels. Now, looking specifically at Luke, Luke was a very interesting gospel because Luke's point, or his perception, was we had a lot of young new converts. And they want to know about the life of Jesus, but they want to know something else. The Gospels say very clearly, follow me. So they're asking the question, how do I follow? How do I follow Jesus? And so the Gospel is written from the perspective of, this is what it's going to take to be a disciple. This is what it's going to take, not just to learn the story of Jesus. Anybody can learn the story of Jesus. He was born, he was crucified. You learn the story. But that's not what he came to teach you. How are you going to how are you going to incorporate the teachings? It's not just, let me remember the parables and the aphorisms. Jesus taught with a purpose and a point to make you disciples, or as he would say, fishers of men. So Luke's gospel carries a motif all the way through. It's called on the way. Everybody was on the way in Luke's gospel because it's symbolic of how Luke perceived our spiritual growth. It's a journey, and we're always on the way. We never come and stop and say, well, I'm done now. No, we're on the way. Now, this is what's interesting about Luke's gospel. Luke is passionate about the story of Jesus and how Jesus was on the way. But then there is the death and resurrection. But now, the people that Luke is looking at, writing this book for, don't really, they heard the stories and they want to follow Jesus, and they want to ask the question, then what? You know, isn't that a common human thing? We read the book. How many sequels of Star Wars can there be? Why? Because we say, and then what? What happened to Luke Skywalker? Where did Darth Vader come from? Oh, we'll do a prequel, and then we'll do a sequel, and we'll do all these stories, right? Because this is part of our human nature. We want to know, and then what? So originally, the Gospel of Luke was actually the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts together. Over the course of time, they were split. So we have to remember that in the Gospel of Luke, Luke is talking about Jesus on the way. In the book of Acts, he is talking about the disciples now, and I'm not just speaking about the immediate 12, I'm talking about the disciples of the communities that he was in charge of. They are on the way. They're sharing the message. They're spreading it out. So what is this on the way? What is this kind of thing that the disciple, or that Luke is trying to hold us together, weaving his story, this underpinning? First of all, Luke says, in order to be a disciple, there has to be an awakening. Secondly, he says, after the awakening, you have to own that awakening, and you have to begin to live from the perspective of the awakening. And third, you have to go as far as you can and die to new life. So here's the stories. The awakening story. We open up the Gospel of Luke, and what's happening? Mary and Joseph are on the way. What's happening? A birth story. So if we're going to be disciples, we have to give birth to an awakening, to an understanding. Wow, that spiritual nature, that Christ nature within us is not just about Jesus. It's my life, it's my inner world, and it's my inner life. This is where I need to come to whenever we call it Christmas. We have that awakening experience where we suddenly get, as we've never gotten before, wow, God isn't out there somewhere. God has not abandoned those people somewhere over there, but rather that God life is within me. And by virtue of the fact that God life is within me, it is within all of us. So I awaken to it. The baby is born. Then the second journey. The baby grows up. But the baby hasn't incorporated, hasn't claimed his identity. So what do we see in the story of Jesus? He's on the way to see who? John. He's on the way to be baptized. And we saw over the last month, we've been looking at these particular stories, how when he comes up out of the water and he hears that you are the beloved Son in whom you are well pleased, he owns that as his own. He struggles with it. He doesn't get it because the story tells us that he's on the way immediately out to the wilderness to kind of sit with it and be with it and go, what was that all about? What does it mean to be the divine Son? What does it mean to awaken and then have this spiritual experience that is my spirit? Nobody else heard it. The story itself tells us nobody else heard it. It's my spiritual awakening. And then he's on the way to Nazareth. And what happens there? He begins to preach. He begins to teach. He begins to heal. He begins to perform miracles. He begins to incorporate what it means in his understanding to be the divine Son. As the gospel sort of begins to wind down, he's on the way to Jerusalem. In fact, Luke says he turns his face. It's like, I turn my face toward Jerusalem. And everything I've ever known or everything I've ever understood about what it means to be the awakened divine Son, I have to move away from that now to let it all go, to experience a new life, to break, I'm going to call it to break the boundaries, to break the barriers, to break the comfort systems. Using our kind of language and vernacular, we've got to break those comfort systems and allow ourselves to be raw and sensitive. Remember the story in the garden? Now it's in the Gospel of John, not Luke, where Mary comes to touch him and he says, do not touch me. He's raw, he's vulnerable, he is energy, he is life. And the boundaries are gone. And he heals even just by his presence and his word. Wow, such a fascinating story. And then the book closes because Jesus has now completed the cycle of his on the way. And the same story opens up for the disciples. We see an awakening. We call it Pentecost. 50 days after Easter, the disciples experience this awakening. After that, Jesus says to them, why are you looking at me? Why are you waiting? Remember the story? I love the story. Jesus comes into their midst and he says, well, I'm going back to heaven now. And he ascends and they're all kind of... And the story says, the angel of the Lord came and said, why are you looking up? Well, I don't know. That's the direction he went, right? We've got to be on the way now. Jesus doesn't want us standing here looking up, rather incorporating and moving forward. And ultimately, we see that the boundaries, as we see the stories about Peter, as we see the stories about Paul, as we see the stories about the early disciples, we're on the way to spread the news. And the book of Acts closes with Paul being on the way to Spain, even though he never really did get there. Because we see that he was on the way, but he got as far as Rome. But in a way, Paul did get there, because he understood very clearly if he got to the center, he got to the empire. Paul was a brilliant man, make no mistake about that. We sometimes chafe against Paul, we sometimes don't understand Paul, but do not mistake that he was a very brilliant man. And he understood through his own vision, his own awakening, what it meant to be the divine Son, what it meant to claim it and take it out into the world. I can't help but think that those three steps, those three journeys, are journeys that we all make. You know, in a way, we can talk about them in a sequential order, but you know and I know that they don't often happen sequentially. All that stuff is happening all at one time, isn't it? At one moment, we're awakening. At one moment, we're breaking our comfort zones. At one moment, we're declaring our divine relationship, and at another moment, we're awakening to it. So all of it is in the mix at one time, but it's very difficult to talk about it if we don't use a sequential order. And so it comes to me that I question, and I'm sure we all do, how then do I, as a spiritually seeking person, take that journey? How do I how do I identify those various aspects? Am I in the awakening? Am I in the claiming? Or am I in the boundary breaking? Where do I fall in that? And how do I really engage it in a real life world in which I live? In a real life world in which I live. 11 years ago, I wrote an article for the newspaper when I was back in California. It was the day after the Virginia Tech shootings. And in that article, I said, I hope this will be the last time I ever have to write for such an event, for such a scene. And yet, Valentine's Day, we opened the news. And I say to myself, number one, I don't get it. Children shooting children. I sort of get an adult. But I don't get how a child shoots another child. He was 19. I don't consider that an adult. How did that happen? And the even more important question is, what do I, Marianne Harris, do about it? How do I encounter this? Because what happens is, and I'm sure you've all seen it, we are quick to put it in a box. Gun legislation, that's what we need. Aha, a change in the policies, that's what we need. Well, they're mentally ill, then that's what we need. And when we do that, folks, I want you to hear me clear. This came to me so clear the other day, is every time we put somebody in the box, then it isn't a box I'm responsible for, and I'm done with the problem. I am not a legislature, so I can't change gun law. I do not work in the Mental Health Clinic Association, so that's their problem. We ought to give them more funds. It negates me from encountering and engaging the story as a spiritual being. Because at the bottom line, folks, this isn't a story about gun control or politics or all of that stuff or the Mental Health Association. It is a spiritual story. Something in our spiritual nature is broken. Something has been left open to bleed. And part of it is we as people of faith need to recognize how quick we are to dismiss. 11 years ago, it was all over the news. Now it's all done in the news. But if it was your child, would it be done? If it happened up at Edison, would it be done? How do we engage this? Let's go back to Luke. What does he tell us? First and foremost, we have to wake up. We have to wake up to the fact. Now, I need to make a little disclaimer here, because people automatically think there we go into that airy-fairy stuff again. I am not negating our responsibility politically. I'm not negating our responsibility economically and the mental health. I'm not. But what I want you to hear is there's a sequence of events that we have backwards. And if we're ever going to put a stop to these situations, we've got to first awaken to the fact that this is a spiritual problem, and we as people of faith must waken up to be sensitive to the cries and the heart of the perpetrator as well as the victim. And this is something we don't want to do. It's like, oh, that kid's got a problem, or that person's got a problem. When we dismiss them and discount them, we say it Sunday after Sunday, there is only one. Not comma, except for. There's only one. What happened to these broken hearts, to these broken lives that they don't know they are one. Part of it is because we don't own them as one. And so time and time again, the same scenario happens. I know, and you're sitting there and saying it the same as I do, God, I have so much on my head. I have so much going on in my life. I don't know that I can deal with this. But you know what? We got to. Because we say that we're standing in an awakened state of realizing and recognizing the Christ presence within us. And we're going to claim ownership to that Christ presence, not just claim ownership as Jesus did, but we are going to go out into the marketplace, not to hand out daily words and not to preach it and get everybody here next Sunday and make sure they watch the YouTube video. But we are going to live a life when people start saying, well, that was just a mental health issue, and well, it's a political issue. Well, wait a minute. But what about the heart and soul of a human who is so broken and so wounded? Is it really, I wonder, I just can't help but wonder, is it really a mental health issue? Really? Because that seems to be our new box. Did you notice? It always seems to be a mental health issue. Those guys, they got that. Or is it something much more fundamental? Do we not know? You see, because we can't say to someone, well, don't you know you're the Christ in expression? Unless we've awakened. We can't say, you should live a better life, if I'm not owning my Christ presence and striving to live a better life. None of us are perfect. We trip, we fall, we hurt, we abuse, we betray, we do all of those things because it's a very real human experience that we do. But here's the last piece of this, which I think is so critical. Remember I said that in Jesus' journey, it's an awakening, it's an ownership of the Christ nature within us, and then the death and resurrection, the breaking down of barriers. And to me, that's where our job to really, we need to stop people when they say, well, it's those people. Because you know what those people are? They're those people. No, they're my people. Those people are our people. Those children are our children, both the ones who were injured and died and the ones who perpetrated the crime. They are our children. They are not somebody else's children to deal with. But we can't just go and take them and say, okay, you can live in my home and you can. No, we can't. So where do we start? We must start by our own inner work, because it's from our inner work that the outer work will come, because we have a new understanding and a new appreciation of what it means to be one. What does it mean to be one with those who have hurt and injured those we love? I don't know about you, but that is a challenge beyond all challenge. That is the symbology of Jesus going through the death experience to be resurrected. He had to break the boundaries and the barriers and the comfort zones and the things that he had always held to be what it meant to be the divine Son, to experience the life as the divine Son. And you and I must do that same journey. There are no exceptions. If you stand forward and say, I'm a person of faith, then you must awaken, you must claim it, you must work at it, and you ultimately will die to that self to open those boundaries and barriers. That's the only way it will heal. Because legislation will take its time, and gun laws will change when they change. And there'll be all kinds of fighting. But what happens in the meantime? See, this is something you can do today. This is somewhere you can start. See, I don't know about you, but when I see things like this happen, I just go deer in the headlights. I don't even know where to start. I don't even know what to think. I don't even know how to handle this. I don't know what's going on. And I have all these questions that will never, never, never be answered on the level of the outside. All I know is my heart cries. I can hear the screams of the children. And when I can hear that, and when I can feel that, then it will drive me to action to change my life so that I can change the life of others. It will not happen any other way. And I am so impressed with these young people who have come out of such an awful situation. And they come on the news with such confidence and poise after such a traumatic event. They will change NRA. They will change the world because we have demonstrated to them what it means to be confident and empowered. Our parents changed automotive rules. You and I changed smoking laws. Oh, the tobacco industry will never be broken. Oh, really? And now we say, do you hear the rhetoric? The NRA will never be broken. The power of it. Now, I'm not, please don't go into you're anti-gun and all that kind of stuff. I'm just saying there's a power there that's an unreasonable, off-balance power. And it will be our children who have been the victims of these kinds of things that will be the voters of tomorrow. And they will say, stop, as that young man did in that video, hours, moments after the event. Folks, the worst thing we can do, and the thing that I know you struggle with and I struggle with too, is think we have no power. Is to think we don't know what to do. We are people of faith, and therefore we're going to call on that faith. We're going to call on it to awaken to a greater realization of the oneness of all. We're going to call on it to claim our divine birthright, not only for ourselves, but for all of our brothers and sisters upon this planet, regardless of their faith, their color, their race, their lifestyle choices. We are one, and it is a struggle to get there. And I know it because I do it myself. I'm quick to say, those people. No. We are one. And ultimately, we are going to be challenged as individuals, as a society, and as a world to break barriers that have never been broken before, to break into new awareness that has never been seen before. We are going to be challenged to be uncomfortable and put to the edge. But if we're people of faith, we understand that death is the avenue toward new life. So as these things have seemed to gain momentum already in the year 2018, 46 days old, there have been 18 of these shootings. That doesn't count suicide. That's where several people were involved. There's an escalation because there's a heart that hurts. Not because we have a broken society, or not because we need to change gun laws, or not because they're all mentally ill, or not because they're in a box. There's a society of souls that we need to be a healing presence. And by the fact that we are healed, Jesus said, if I be lifted up, then all men will come to me. Your job, my job, is to lift up the light, lift up the healing, lift up the wholeness, and not continually recycle the ain't it awfuls and gee, how much worse can it get? But to say, this is the light of God. There is a miracle in here. I don't understand it and I don't see it. But I trust that as I do my work, as I awaken, claim, and resurrect my spiritual journey, I will draw the healing to the world. Thank you and God bless.